The first fine was taped to my fence at 6:30 in the morning, not mailed, not emailed. Taped there like a warning sign someone wanted me to see before I even finished my coffee. Bright orange paper snapping in the wind, impossible to ignore. It said my fence violated community standards. It said I had 10 days to remove it. It said the fine would double if I didn't comply. What unsettled me wasn't the accusation itself, it was how deliberate it felt. I'd installed that fence 3 weeks earlier with a county permit in hand, after reading the HOA handbook line by line, height checked, setbacks measured, materials approved. I'd done everything by the book because I didn't want trouble. And yet here it was. A violation with no explanation, no photo, no reference to any rule I'd supposedly broken, just a threat. I stood there and looked up and down the street. 4 fences nearly identical to mine. Same height, same material, same color, all untouched, all approved. That's when it clicked. This wasn't about a fence. It was about who they decided to target. And once I started paying attention, I realized something worse. I wasn't the first. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Gone Wild and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? I moved to Willow Ridge, just outside a small Midwestern town called Briarfield, a few months after my divorce was finalized. I wasn't chasing a fresh start in some dramatic way. I just wanted quiet, predictable days. A place where nothing happened unless I wanted it to. The house checked every box. Single story, corner lot. An old oak tree out front that looked like it had seen more than I had. Nothing flashy. Nothing that would draw attention. The fence wasn't a statement. It was for my dog and, honestly, for my peace of mind. After everything I'd been through, I wanted one small thing I could control. That's why I was careful. Before installing it, I pulled a county permit. I measured the setbacks twice. I compared fence diagrams in the HOA handbook to the inch. I even sent an email to the HOA's general inbox asking if there were any additional restrictions not listed in the rules. I never got a reply, but the handbook was clear. Chain link fences were allowed. Height limits were spelled out. Placement rules were simple. I followed everything. Or at least, I thought I did. After the first fine came a second notice less than a week later. This one said the fence material was aesthetic non-compliant. That phrase stuck with me because it didn't mean anything specific. There were no measurements. No color issues. No reference to a rule number. Just a vague claim that something about my fence didn't fit the neighborhood, which was strange considering at least half the street had the same type of fence. Still no photos. Still no explanation. That's when I requested a hearing. Not angrily, not defensively, just formally. I assumed there had been some kind of mistake and that a normal conversation would clear it up. The response came from the HOA head, a woman named Lorraine Halstead. It was a single sentence. The board has determined the violation is valid. That was it. No date for a hearing, no appeal process. No explanation of how they'd reached that determination. Just a statement that carried the weight of final authority. It was subtle, but it landed hard. Around that time, I started noticing things I'd brushed off before. My neighbor Carlos mentioned he'd been fined for a mailbox that had been sitting there for over 10 years without issue. Mrs. Bennett, the older woman across the street who paid a lawn service every single week, suddenly had multiple notices about overgrown grass taped to her door. None of them had pictures attached. None of them listed specific measurements, just deadlines. And every notice followed the same structure. Quick delivery. Short deadline. Language about escalating fines. Mentions of liens if issues remained unresolved. It wasn't enforcement language. It was pressure language. I started paying closer attention to which houses were getting notices and which weren't. The homes with newer owners, the ones with single residents, the people who didn't attend HOA meetings or socialize with the board. Meanwhile, properties owned by longtime residents or people friendly with the HOA leadership seemed invisible. Their violations, if they existed at all, went unmentioned. When I finally ran into Lorraine in person near the mailbox cluster, I asked her calmly why my fence was an issue when others on the same street had nearly identical ones. She didn't get defensive. She didn't argue. She smiled. "Every property is evaluated individually," she said. It sounded reasonable, polite, professional, but it didn't answer the question. I walked away feeling unsettled in a way I couldn't quite explain yet. It wasn't anger. It wasn't fear. It was the sense that I'd stepped into a system that didn't run on clear rules, but on discretion. And discretion, I was starting to learn, is where power hides. That was my first real lesson in how selective enforcement works. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't shout. It wraps itself in calm language and smiles while quietly deciding who belongs and who doesn't. At that point, I still believed things could be fixed with reason, with patience, with the assumption that everyone was acting in good faith. I didn't yet understand that the rules weren't the point. The rules were just the tool. The pressure didn't arrive all at once. It crept in quietly, the way something dangerous usually does. One afternoon, I pulled into my driveway and noticed my side gate was open. That alone wouldn't have meant much, except I never left it open. My dog was inside, restless, pacing. Near the fence line, the ground was churned up with fresh footprints pressed into the mud. At first, I assumed someone had made a mistake, maybe a neighbor, maybe a delivery driver cutting through. Then, I saw the notice taped to my door. The HOA claimed they'd conducted an emergency inspection due to a potential safety concern. That was the entire explanation. No description of the danger. No photos. No timeline. Just a statement that they'd entered my property without notice because they said they had the authority to do so. I stood there reading it twice, trying to figure out what emergency could possibly involve my fence. There wasn't one. Later that evening, a neighbor mentioned seeing a contractor's truck parked near my house earlier that day. According to him, a man I didn't recognize had been walking my property line, stopping to take pictures of my fence, my yard, the side of my house. No one had knocked. No one had called. 2 days after that, 3 new violations appeared in my mailbox. Fence height, fence placement, fence structural integrity, each one vague, each one unsupported, each one accompanied by a deadline that felt intentionally short, like someone wanted me to panic before I had time to think. None of it made sense. The fence hadn't changed. Nothing had shifted. Nothing was broken or leaning. I walked the entire length of it with a tape measure and compared it to the original permit documents. Everything matched. That's when the tone changed. A certified letter arrived, heavy and formal, warning that accumulated fines could result in a lien against my property. Not immediately, but if unresolved. That phrase started following me everywhere. If unresolved. May result. Subject to further action. It was language designed to sit in your head long after you'd finished reading. Language that didn't accuse, but implied. Language that made you imagine worst-case scenarios without ever stating them outright. They weren't trying to scare me with one big threat. They were layering smaller ones, stacking pressure slowly and methodically. I tried to take away their excuses. I called a local handyman to reinforce one of the fence posts, even though it didn't need it. I figured if there was absolutely nothing they could point to, the notices would stop. The handyman agreed, set a date, and seemed normal about it. The morning of the job, he called to cancel. His voice sounded tight. He said he'd had a call and didn't feel comfortable getting involved. He wouldn't say who called him. He wouldn't elaborate, just apologized and wished me luck. That was the moment the situation shifted from frustrating to unsettling. Up until then, I'd assumed this was just an overzealous HOA flexing authority. Annoying, but contained. Something that stayed on paper. Now it felt like the walls were closing in. Contractors didn't want to touch my property. Neighbors avoided eye contact when the topic came up. People lowered their voices when they talked about the HOA, like the walls might be listening. I started noticing things that had nothing to do with fences. Lorraine's car slowing down as it passed my house. Board members walking the neighborhood with clipboards, stopping only at certain properties. Notices appearing on doors late at night or early in the morning when no one was around to question them. The fines kept coming. Each one cited a different subsection of the rules. Each one added to the total balance. Each one mentioned liens a little more directly than the last. I wasn't being yelled at. I wasn't being threatened face to face. I was being isolated. The HOA never raised their voice. They never knocked on my door. They never argued with me. They let paper do the work for them. Paper, deadlines, and silence. At night, I'd sit at my kitchen table rereading the letters, wondering how many people before me had folded at this stage. How many had paid fines they didn't owe just to make it stop. How many had sold their homes under pressure, telling themselves it wasn't worth the stress. That's when the fear finally settled in. Not panic, not rage. The fear of being slowly cornered, of realizing that every path forward required approval from people who had already decided I was a problem. They weren't trying to win an argument. They were trying to exhaust me. And the most unsettling part was how calm they were about it, like this was routine, like they'd done it before, like they knew exactly how long it took before someone stopped pushing back and started complying. That's when I understood something important. This wasn't a dispute. It was a process, and unless I interrupted it, it was only going to end one way. The shift didn't come from a lawyer, a letter, or some sudden act of courage on my part. It came from a knock on my door just after sunset. Mrs. Bennett stood there holding a small digital recorder in both hands like it was fragile. She looked nervous, the way people do when they're about to hand you something they've been carrying alone for too long. I invited her inside, and she sat at my kitchen table without taking off her coat. She told me she lived in Willow Ridge for almost 20 years, long enough to see different boards cycle through, long enough to recognize patterns. After her husband passed, she'd started attending HOA meetings more regularly, partly to stay busy, partly because she didn't feel comfortable trusting everything that was said. I started recording them, she said quietly, just to feel safer. She apologized before even showing me anything, like she was afraid she was doing something wrong by telling the truth. Then she pressed play. At first, it sounded like any other meeting. Papers shuffling, chairs scraping, casual voices. Then Lorraine's voice came through, relaxed and confident, like she was speaking among friends. If we don't push these problem properties early, she said, they drag values down. Better to handle it now. The words hit me harder than I expected. Someone else asked, almost jokingly, what about consistency? Lorraine laughed, not nervously, not defensively. She laughed like the question didn't matter. Consistency is flexible, she said. The room went quiet after that. On the recording and in my kitchen, Mrs. Bennett stopped the audio and looked at me, waiting. That was the moment everything shifted. Up until then, I'd been defending myself, explaining, responding, trying to prove I wasn't breaking the rules, trying to show I was reasonable. But that recording reframed everything. This wasn't strict enforcement. It wasn't miscommunication. It wasn't a misunderstanding of the rules. It was intent. They weren't enforcing standards. They were selecting targets. And now, for the first time, it wasn't my interpretation versus theirs. It wasn't my frustration against their authority. It was their own words. I asked Mrs. Bennett how many recordings she had. Enough, she said. Enough to show it's not just you. That night, after she left, I didn't sleep much, not because I was scared, but because my mind wouldn't stop reorganizing everything I'd experienced. Every fine, every vague notice, every contractor who backed out, every neighbor who'd suddenly gone quiet. It all lined up. They weren't improvising. They were following a script. Once I understood that, my approach changed completely. I stopped trying to fix the fence. I started documenting the system. I pulled every HOA notice I'd received and laid them out in order. Dates, language, deadlines. I highlighted phrases that repeated. I compared them to the handbook. I noted where rules were cited vaguely or not at all. Then I started paying attention to what wasn't documented. No emergency declarations, no inspection reports, no photos attached to violations, no meeting minutes that matched the actions taken. Mrs. Bennett wasn't the only one watching. When I spoke quietly with a few neighbors, doors started opening. Carlos admitted he'd kept copies of every mailbox notice he'd received over the years. Another homeowner mentioned being fined only after refusing to use an HOA-recommended contractor. Patterns emerged once people felt safe enough to talk. The HOA liked paper, but they didn't like transparency. They relied on the assumption that no one would compare notes, that everyone would think their situation was isolated. That fear would keep people quiet and compliance would keep the process moving. I stopped responding emotionally to notices. I replied in writing, briefly, factually. I requested documentation instead of explanations. I asked for dates, rule numbers, and authority citations. Most of the time, I got silence. That silence told me more than any response could have. When another violation arrived claiming structural integrity concerns, I replied asking for the inspection report, the credentials of the inspector, and the emergency declaration authorizing entry. I sent it certified. I kept copies. No reply. That's when I realized something else. They were confident as long as no one challenged the foundation of their authority. The moment you asked for proof, not explanations, the system stalled, because it wasn't built to withstand scrutiny. The recording from Mrs. Bennett wasn't just evidence. It was leverage. It turned this from a homeowner dispute into a governance issue, from a personal conflict into a documented pattern of selective enforcement. For the first time since this started, I felt something close to calm. Not relief, not victory. Clarity. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't overreacting. And I wasn't alone. They had underestimated one thing. They assumed no one was paying attention. And once that assumption broke, so did their control. From that point on, I stopped asking myself how to make it stop. I started asking how to make it undeniable. I stopped reacting, and I started documenting. It wasn't a dramatic decision. It was quiet, almost boring, and that's exactly why it worked. I bought a notebook and a cheap file organizer. Every notice went into it. Every envelope, every email. I logged dates, times, wording, and delivery methods. I took photos of my fence from every angle, then did the same for other fences on the street that matched mine almost exactly. Same height, same material, same placement. I wasn't trying to make a point yet. I was building a record. I requested copies of the HOA handbook versions they claimed to be enforcing. I compared them to the one I'd been given at purchase. The language matched, but enforcement didn't. Some rules were suddenly being interpreted in ways that had never appeared in writing. Then I started pulling public records. Vendor contracts were filed with the county. Payments were traceable. Names repeated. That's when the pattern finally surfaced clearly enough that I could see it without emotion getting in the way. The fencing contractor used for so-called inspections was owned by Lorraine's brother-in-law, different last name. Same mailing address listed on business filings. Payments routed through a holding company that showed up nowhere in the HOA disclosures. The landscaping company issuing lawn citations had billed the HOA for repeat rechecks on properties that hadn't been re-inspected at all. Same dates. Same charges. Multiple invoices for work that neighbors confirmed never happened. This wasn't about standards. It was about flow. Money moved when violations appeared. Vendors got paid when pressure escalated. And the people being fined were the same ones who didn't socialize with the board, didn't attend meetings, didn't push back. I started mapping it out. Not dramatically, just lines on paper. Violations to vendors, vendors to board connections. Dates lining up with enforcement spikes. The system didn't look messy anymore. It looked efficient. That's when I stopped trying to explain myself to the HOA altogether. I stopped arguing about the fence. I stopped correcting their language. I responded only with written requests for documentation, rule numbers, inspection reports, emergency declarations, proof of service. Most of the time, nothing came back. Silence was becoming their default response, and that told me something important. They were comfortable issuing pressure but uncomfortable justifying it. That's when I reached out to Rachel Moore. She was a local property attorney with a reputation for being methodical and patient. Not flashy, not aggressive. The kind of lawyer people hired when they wanted something to hold up under scrutiny. I didn't tell her my story emotionally. I handed her a folder. She didn't skim it. She didn't interrupt. She took her time, flipping through pages, asking short questions. Do you have delivery dates for these? Yes. Any inspection reports attached? No. Any emergency declarations in writing? None. She nodded slowly, like she was confirming something she already suspected. She didn't promise a win. She didn't talk about lawsuits or dramatic consequences. She said one sentence that stuck with me. Documentation beats authority every time, but only if you let it finish speaking. Her advice was simple. Keep doing what I was doing. Don't escalate emotionally. Don't threaten. Don't tip my hand. Let the pattern mature. She explained that systems like this collapse not when they're challenged loudly, but when they're asked to explain themselves repeatedly and consistently. When the same questions are asked in writing. When the same requests for proof are ignored. When timelines start to matter. She helped me organize my records into something clean, chronological, cross-referenced, easy to follow. For the first time since this started, I felt steady, not confident, not victorious, grounded. The fear that had been sitting in my chest for weeks started to loosen, not because the problem was gone, but because I finally understood it. The HOA wasn't all-powerful. It was procedural. And procedure leaves fingerprints. From that point on, every new notice went straight into the file. Every response was measured. Every interaction was documented. I wasn't trying to win an argument anymore. I was letting the system document itself into a corner. And the calmer I became, the more erratic their behavior grew. That contrast mattered. Because when this eventually moved beyond neighborhood letters and into rooms where facts mattered more than tone, I knew exactly which side would still be standing. For the first time since the orange paper showed up on my fence, I wasn't waiting for the next threat. I was ready for it. The notice for the hearing arrived by certified mail, heavy with implication before I even opened it. It wasn't a hearing for me, it was a hearing for the lien. The letter stated that I had failed to correct ongoing violations, that fines had continued to accrue, and that the board would be reviewing enforcement action under its authority. The language was polished and confident, written as if the outcome was already decided, and the meeting was just a formality. Rachel read it once and nodded. "They're skipping steps," she said. "That usually means they're nervous." The hearing was scheduled for a weekday evening at the community clubhouse. When we arrived, the room was set up to feel official. Long table at the front. name placards. A stack of folders in front of Lorraine and the board members. A few folding chairs for homeowners, most of them empty. Lorraine opened the meeting by summarizing my continued non-compliance. She spoke calmly, confidently, like someone used to not being interrupted. She listed violations by date, referenced fines by amount, and concluded by saying the board was prepared to proceed with lien authorization if the issues remained unresolved. Rachel didn't interrupt. She didn't object. She just listened. When Lorraine finished, Rachel stood and thanked the board for their time. Then she asked her first question. Can you provide the inspection report supporting these violations? Lorraine blinked. She gestured to the folders. The violations are documented. Rachel smiled politely. I'm asking for inspection reports, dates, inspector names, findings. Lorraine flipped through the folder in front of her. Papers rustled. Someone cleared their throat. We don't typically generate formal reports, Lorraine said. The board conducts visual assessments. Rachel nodded. Then can you provide the emergency declaration that authorized entry onto my client's property without notice? The room went quiet. Lorraine adjusted in her chair. The board has authority to act in emergencies. Rachel didn't argue. I understand. I'm asking for the written declaration identifying the emergency, the date it was declared, and who authorized it. No one answered. Rachel continued, still calm. You referenced prior notices. Can you provide proof of service for each one? Dates delivered, methods used. More silence. Board members began shifting in their seats. One of them leaned toward Lorraine and whispered. Lorraine waved him off. Rachel wasn't done. You've cited accumulated fines, she said. Can you provide the ledger showing when each fine was assessed, when notices were sent, and how interest was calculated? At that point, Lorraine closed her folder. The board has determined the enforcement is valid, she said, her voice tighter than before. This meeting is not a debate. Rachel nodded again. Understood. Then please note for the record that the board has declined to provide documentation supporting the lien action. That did it. Lorraine called for a brief recess, then returned and announced the meeting was adjourned pending further review. No vote. No resolution. Just an abrupt end. As we walked out, Rachel leaned toward me and said quietly, they just documented their own problem. 2 days later, it escalated anyway. I was at work when my phone buzzed with a text from a neighbor. There's a crew at your place. Chainsaws. I drove home as fast as I could. A truck with an unmarked trailer was parked in front of my house. 3 men stood near my oak tree, measuring and pointing. One of them held paperwork. Another had a chainsaw resting against his leg. I got out of my car and asked what they were doing. They said they were contracted by the HOA to remove the tree due to root interference with fence stability. They showed me a work order signed by Lorraine. I asked for a permit. They didn't have one. I asked for an arborist report. They didn't have that either. I told them to stop. One of the men shrugged and said, "We're just doing what we're told." That was the moment something inside me went still. This wasn't pressure anymore. This wasn't paperwork. This was irreversible damage. A tree that had been there longer than any board member. Something that couldn't be undone once it started. I called Rachel. She told me to call the police. When the officer arrived, he asked simple questions. Permit numbers. Authorization. Proof of emergency. The crew couldn't provide any of it. The officer told them to pack up and leave. As they drove away, Lorraine pulled up in her car. She didn't get out. She just sat there for a moment, watching. I realized then that the hearing hadn't been about the lien at all. It had been a test. They'd wanted to see how far they could push. Whether I'd fold under the weight of authority, whether I'd back down when the stakes felt real. Instead, they'd crossed a line they couldn't step back over. Because paper pressure can be argued. But attempted destruction leaves witnesses, and from that moment on, this wasn't just an HOA dispute anymore. It was a record of overreach. I called the police. Not angry, not shaking, just clear. I told them there were people on my property without permission, attempting to remove a protected tree. I told them there was no permit posted. I told them the work order came from an HOA that had already been asked, in writing, to stop enforcement actions pending documentation. An officer arrived within minutes. He didn't take sides. He asked questions. Who authorized the work? What emergency justified it? Where the permit was? The crew couldn't answer any of it. The officer photographed the tree, the equipment, the work order, and the truck. He wrote everything down. He told the workers to leave and warned them that returning without proper authorization would be trespass. That mattered more than it looked like at the time, because from that moment on, this wasn't just paper and opinions. It was an incident report, a neutral record created by someone who didn't care about HOA politics. Rachel filed for an emergency injunction that same afternoon. The filing wasn't dramatic. It was precise. It asked the court to halt all enforcement actions, inspections, fines, and property access until the HOA could produce documentation supporting its claims. It included the attempted tree removal, the lack of permits, and the pattern of selective enforcement. When the court granted the temporary injunction, the tone shifted overnight. The HOA went quiet, no new notices. No taped warnings, no late-night letters. Silence, like a system that had lost its rhythm. Then discovery began. Rachel requested financial records, vendor contracts, payment histories, communication logs related to enforcement decisions. The HOA resisted at first, claimed burden, claimed privacy, claimed irrelevance. The judge didn't agree. What came out wasn't shocking in the way movies make things shocking. It was worse. It was mundane, transactional, repetitive. The same vendors appeared again and again. The same properties generated fines again and again. The same board members approved payments again and again. Invoices for inspections that never happened. Charges for rechecks with no corresponding reports. Payments routed through intermediary companies tied to board members' families. And threaded through it all were the recordings. Mrs. Bennett's audio didn't stand alone anymore. It was supported by emails, meeting notes, and patterns of behavior that matched exactly what Lorraine had joked about. Problem properties, early pressure, flexible consistency. The HOA's attorney tried to frame it as poor record-keeping, as enthusiastic enforcement, as mistakes made by volunteers. But mistakes don't repeat this cleanly. Mistakes don't follow the same people. Mistakes don't generate consistent revenue streams. As the picture sharpened, neighbors who had stayed quiet started coming forward, not emotionally, carefully, with copies of notices, with timelines, with matching stories, each one small on its own. Together, undeniable. The injunction held. The lien attempt was frozen. The board meetings stopped being private conversations and started becoming recorded events with attorneys present. Lorraine stopped speaking as much. Then, 3 days before the scheduled court hearing, she resigned. The email was short. She cited personal reasons. She thanked the community for the opportunity to serve. It didn't save her. Resignation didn't erase the records. It didn't undo the invoices. It didn't change the audio. And it didn't stop the investigation that had already begun. The court hearing went forward without her at the table. Rachel presented the timeline calmly. No raised voice, no theatrics, just facts lined up in order. The judge didn't need long. The enforcement actions were invalidated. The lien attempt was voided. The HOA was ordered to reimburse improperly assessed fines. A forensic audit was mandated. Future enforcement was placed under oversight until new board elections could be conducted according to the bylaws. No gavel slam. No dramatic speech. Just consequences. Outside the courthouse, I stood for a moment and realized my hands weren't shaking. For weeks, the HOA had relied on something simple: that people would be too scared, too tired, or too alone to push back. That authority would be enough. They never expected documentation to push back harder. The collapse didn't come from one big reveal. It came from their own records being read out loud, one after another, in a room where tone didn't matter and facts did. That was the real climax. Not the resignation, not the injunction. The moment when their system, stripped of intimidation, couldn't explain itself anymore. Once that happened, everything else was just cleanup. The lien attempt was voided quietly, the way things often end when they never should have started in the first place. There was no announcement posted on the community board. No apology letter slid under doors. Just a court order stating that the lien authorization had been improper and unenforceable. The fines tied to it were invalid. Any payments already collected under that enforcement were to be refunded. Checks started arriving in mailboxes within a few weeks. Some neighbors didn't cash them right away. A few people I spoke to said it felt like a trick, like something else would follow if they acknowledged it. That's how deep the pressure had gone. Even when the power was gone, the fear lingered. The court ordered the HOA board to be restructured under supervision. Emergency authority was suspended. New elections were scheduled with notice requirements spelled out in painful detail. Meetings had to be recorded. Minutes had to be published. Enforcement actions had to reference specific rule sections and include documentation. The vendors were replaced. All of them. Contracts tied to board members or their families were terminated. New bids were required. Independent inspections had to be conducted by licensed professionals with written reports attached. No more vague assessments. No more drive-by evaluations. No one was arrested. No one was dragged out in handcuffs. This wasn't a movie, but something more important happened. The system stopped working the way it used to. Lorraine didn't come back. Neither did two other board members who resigned shortly after the audit findings were released. The new board was quieter, cautious, almost overly careful. They followed the rules because now they knew someone was watching, and so did everyone else. Neighbors who hadn't spoken to each other in months started talking again. Conversations that used to drop into whispers happened out in driveways. People compared notes openly, not angrily. Just honestly, I heard the same sentence more than once. I thought it was just me. That's what the pressure had done best. It convinced people they were alone. Without that illusion, everything changed. Mrs. Bennett started attending meetings again, this time sitting in the front row. Carlos volunteered for a committee. People who'd never cared about HOA governance before suddenly understood how much it mattered, not because they wanted control, because they didn't want to be controlled. As for me, life slowly returned to normal. The notices stopped. The mailbox stayed empty. No trucks parked outside my house. No footsteps in the mud that weren't mine. The oak tree stood exactly where it always had, leaves catching the light the way they always had. And the fence? It's still there. Same height. Same material, same placement. No one ever mentioned it again. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel like I'd won something. Mostly, I felt tired in a way that comes from prolonged tension finally releasing. The kind of exhaustion that only shows up once you're safe enough to feel it. What stayed with me wasn't anger. It was clarity. Power like that survives on shortcuts, on silence, on the belief that people won't take the time to document what's happening to them. Once that belief breaks, the power doesn't disappear dramatically, it just stops. The neighborhood didn't become perfect. HOAs don't suddenly turn into community picnics and shared harmony. There were still disagreements, still rules, still meetings that ran too long. But there was something new underneath all of it. Accountability. And accountability changes how people behave even when no one is watching. Sometimes I catch myself standing at the fence in the evening, watching my dog run along it, and I think about how close I came to giving in early. Paying the fines. Removing the fence. Telling myself it wasn't worth the trouble. I'm glad I didn't. Not because I proved a point, but because I learned something that applies far beyond one neighborhood. Most systems don't fall because someone attacks them. They fall because someone documents them long enough that they can no longer pretend to be something they're not. That's how this ended. Not with noise, but with the quiet return of ordinary life. And honestly, that was all I wanted in the first place. I didn't win because I was loud. I didn't win because I threatened anyone, embarrassed anyone, or tried to overpower a system that was designed to wear people down quietly. I won because I stayed calm long enough to see how it actually worked. HOAs don't run on muscle. They don't need to. They run on paperwork, assumptions, and fear. Fear of fines, fear of liens, fear of being the only one pushing back. And fear only works when it stays in the dark. Once light shows up, it starts to fade. What I learned through all of this is simple, but it isn't easy. Document everything. Save every notice. Write everything down. Ask for proof instead of explanations. Don't rush just to make the pressure stop. And don't let anger make your decisions for you. Patterns tell the truth better than arguments ever will. When authority depends on silence, it collapses the moment people start comparing notes and putting things on paper. Not dramatically, not all at once, but inevitably. If you're dealing with something like this right now, I want you to hear this clearly. You're not crazy. You're not overreacting. And you're definitely not alone, even if it feels that way. Most people who've been through it don't talk about it because the system trains you not to. But once you understand how it works, it loses its grip. I didn't set out to fight anyone. I just wanted a quiet life and a fence that followed the rules. In the end, that's exactly what I got. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Gone Wild. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from?